I never expected the old hotel to hold anything more than dust and the echoes of its former glory. But as the doors creaked shut behind me, and the musty smell of the dark lobby filled my nose, I felt something strange below, pulsing vibration beneath the surface, as if the building was alive and waiting. The place had been abandoned for 50 years, yet the furnishings were intact. Deep velvet chairs, antique lamps, and a dusty reception desk lined with room keys dangling from rusty hooks. I checked my phone. No signal. Of course, my friends Alex, Jordan, and Claire were with me, and it had been a dare to come here after hearing countless rumors. We'd heard about rooms that weren't there, strange echoes, and whispers of an entity that prowled the hotel's darkest hallways. We brushed it off as urban legend until now, as the night wore on and the air thickened with something we couldn't name. "Did you guys hear that?" Claire whispered, her voice taut with fear. A faint sound drifted through the dim hallway, ahead, a guttural, dragging noise that sent chills down my spine. "Probably just pipes," I said, though my own voice wavered. But we all knew it wasn't pipes. The hotel was silent as a tomb, and yet, just beyond the range of our hearing, something moved, slow and deliberate. "Let's keep moving," Jordan said, pulling out his flashlight and aiming it down the corridor. We wandered through identical hallways, passing rows of rooms numbered in a bizarre sequence that made no sense. Room 100 reset back to 001, only to jump to 013 and back down to 002. The strange arrangement began to feel deliberate, like some sort of labyrinth designed to disorient intruders. Jordan suddenly halted, a confused look on his face. "Didn't we pass room 017 already?" Twice, I looked back. The same brass numbers gleamed on the doors, some painted over with smudges that looked almost like finger marks. "This place is playing tricks on us," Claire whispered, wringing her hands. We pushed forward, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread, but with every step, the air grew colder. Shadows seemed to pool in corners, too dark, as though they absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. And then, faint at first, we heard Ed's low, deep voice drifting through the halls. "Stay with me." I froze, and my blood turned to ice. Alex backed up, his face pale, his eyes darting toward the walls as if expecting something to burst through them. "Did you guys just hear that?" None of us answered. We were transfixed by the sound, a voice that seemed to come from every direction at once, filling our heads with a primal sense of terror. "Let's get out of here," I muttered, turning back toward the way we'd come. But as we retraced our steps, we found only more hallways, each identical, stretching endlessly with no exit in sight. Then the sound of shuffling, dragging footsteps grew louder, closer, until it seemed to vibrate in my skull. We froze, not daring to breathe. And then, slowly, the door at the end of the hall creaked open on its own, revealing a darkness so complete it seemed to absorb the faint light of our flashlights. "Go," Alex hissed. But as we turned to run, the darkness spilled from the room, spreading along the floor like oil, thick and alive, oozing toward us. The lights above flickered, and I saw a monstrous figure emerging from the darkness, towering over us with shoulders that brushed both sides of the hallway. The thing was massive, a hulking beast of muscle and shadow, with skin like cracked stone, covered in dark veins that pulsed with something black and foul. Its face was a twisted nightmare, with deep, empty sockets where eyes should have been, and a mouth stretched impossibly wide, filled with rows of serrated, broken teeth. It growled, a sound so low and deep it vibrated through the floor, rattling our bones. The very air around us seemed to shudder, and an unbearable pressure filled the space, pressing down on us as if we were insects caught in its grip. "Run," I shouted, grabbing Claire's arm and yanking her back. But Jordan was frozen, staring at the creature in horror as it lumbered toward him. The thing moved with a strange, jerking gait, its limbs cracking and snapping as though they were barely held together. And then it lunged. "Jordan," Claire screamed, but it was too late. The creature's massive hand wrapped around him, lifting him off the ground as he struggled and screamed, kicking wildly. I will never forget the look in his eyes, a mix of terror and disbelief as he realized there was no escape. The creature opened its mouth, rows of jagged teeth glinting in the flickering light, and pulled him close, like a child savoring a meal. Jordan's screen was cut off with a sickening crunch. Blood splattered across the walls, warm and thick, painting the hallway in dark, dripping streaks. We ran, ignoring the horror that trailed behind us, hearing the monstrous growls and crunching of bone as it feasted on our friend. We stumbled down corridor after corridor, tripping over our own feet as the thing pursued us, its footsteps echoing in the distance, growing louder with every turn. Then we saw Ida door at the end of the hallway, marked with a single word painted in thick, dark letters. Exit. Hope surged in my chest, and I pushed Claire forward, practically shoving her toward the door. But as we reached it, we saw something horrifying. Beyond the door was no exit-alley, a cavernous, impossible room that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls lined with mirrors that reflected twisted versions of us. Each reflection was worse than the last. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, with faces twisted in agony or twisted smiles that looked more like grimaces. And in the center of the room stood the creature, waiting for us. It had no eyes, but I felt its gaze settle on me, and a cold terror gripped my heart. The beast was covered in fresh blood, the remnants of Jordan's shirt still caught in its teeth. It growled, a deep, resonant sound that filled the space, and took a step toward us. There's nowhere to run, it rasped, its voice like gravel grinding in a pit. You belong to me. Claire backed up, tears streaming down her face. Please, please, let us go. But the creature's mouth split into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of teeth slick with gore. It lunged, moving faster than seemed possible, and I felt a surge of panic as it closed the distance between us in seconds. In a moment of sheer desperation, I grabbed a nearby mirror and smashed it against the ground. The sound seemed to disorient it for a split second, its head whipping around as if it were in pain. I seized the chance, pulling Claire toward the door at the far end, hoping it might lead us out. But as we ran, I realized something chilling. Our reflections in the mirrors had begun to change. They were moving independently, reaching out toward us with desperate, pleading hands, mouths open in silent screams. It was like looking at twisted versions of ourselves trapped in another world, trying to warn us. Don't leave us, they mouthed, over and over, their voices a whisper on the edge of hearing. Finally, we burst through another door and found ourselves back in the lobby, gasping for air. The front doors were wide open, the cold night air streaming in. Without a second thought, we bolted outside, running until the hotel was a distant shadow. We didn't stop, didn't look back, and didn't speak of Jordan. Whatever had taken him, whatever it wasn't human, and I knew it wasn't finished with us. Since that night, Claire and I have barely spoken. We each bear the scars of that place, memories that haunt us, shadows that seem to follow wherever we go. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the whispers calling from the other side of the mirror. The same desperate voice echoing through the darkness. A voice that sounds disturbingly like Jordan's. Help me. I went on a camping trip for fun with my friend Chris. I was going to be away from home for a week. We started heading into the forest. It was muddy and wet like it just rained. It felt strange. I could not spot any wildlife. There was nothing there. We went looking for a good spot to set up our tent, and we found the perfect spot. But it was then that I noticed the trees. They were tall and dense, yes, but their trunks were covered with strange scratches markings, too high for an animal to reach. They spiraled up each tree, all pointing back to the clearing, as if converging on the exact spot we'd chosen to sleep. I told myself it was a coincidence, a trick of nature. But then night fell. Around midnight, I awoke to a soft crunching sound. I was still groggy, thinking it was my friend Chris moving around. But as I opened my eyes, I noticed he was still beside me, sleeping soundly. The noise grew louder, closer. Something was moving just beyond the tree line, circling our tent. I lay still, listening. Whatever it was, it moved with slow, heavy steps, each crunch of dead leaves unnaturally deliberate, as if it wanted us to know it was there. I barely breathed, trying to convince myself it was a deer or maybe a bear. But the footsteps, they didn't fit. Too rhythmic, too methodical. The steps stopped. I strained my ears, listening to the dead silence. Then, from right outside the tent, a soft, almost human whisper, "I see you." I froze, clutching my sleeping bag, praying it was just my mind playing tricks. But then the voice came again, clearer this time, a raspy whisper, "I see you." I was paralyzed, my heart racing as I tried to wake Chris without making a sound. But just as I reached over, everything went silent again. No footsteps, no whisper, nothing. I told myself it was just a dream, a hallucination brought on by the isolation. But then I noticed the faint outline of something outside our tent tall and thin, almost like a person. It stood motionless, blending into the darkness, but the longer I stared, the more it seemed to watch us. At dawn, Chris and I checked around the campsite. There were no footprints, no broken branches, nothing to show that anyone or anything had been there. I could feel Chris's unease, but we were too stubborn to turn back. We pushed on, following a rough trail deeper into the forest. But as we walked, I started to notice something strange. Each tree seemed to bear the same claw-like markings we'd seen in the clearing. They weren't random scratches. They formed spirals, crude symbols I'd never seen before. We kept moving, more wary now, and soon stumbled upon an old hunting cabin. It was half hidden by the dense underbrush, abandoned for who knows how long. But there was something about it that drew me in, a sense of familiarity, as if it wanted me to come closer. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of decay. Faded photos lined the walls, families posing in front of the very trees we'd camped near. But the people in those photos looked wrong, their faces blurred, almost as if the film had burned while developing. And then I noticed something that stopped me cold. In the corner, beneath the broken window, was a stack of sleeping bags and torn clothing. They looked fresh. Chris stepped back, clearly shaken, and whispered, "I don't think we're alone here." That night, we set up camp further away from the cabin, but as darkness settled, the forest around us grew eerily quiet again, not even the rustling of leaves. I could sense something watching, hiding just beyond the fire's glow. Shadows stretched around us, but one seemed different, taller, darker, as if it absorbed the light rather than cast a shadow. We barely slept, taking turns keeping watch. And then, sometime around midnight, the sound returned, that slow, methodical crunch of footsteps, pacing just beyond our firelight. Chris picked up a branch, his hand shaking as he whispered, "Whatever's out there, it's coming closer." I could barely see past the flickering flames, but there, just at the edge, I caught a glimpse of a figure, impossibly tall, its body elongated, arms hanging low, fingers too long and thin, its head tilted slightly, as though curious, studying us. I didn't dare move, hoping it would go away, but then it began to hum, a low, vibrating hum that seemed to shake the ground itself. It grew louder, resonating in my chest, my head pounding as if my skull would crack. Chris dropped the branch, clutching his ears, his face contorted in agony, and then it stopped. The figure had vanished, leaving us in the oppressive silence once more. At dawn, Chris wanted to leave. "Whatever's out there doesn't want us here," he insisted, but something compelled me to stay. I had to know what was in this forest, what it was. We spent the day hiking deeper, the trees growing denser, almost weaving together as if to trap us. That's when we found it. A stone circle covered in ancient moss and strange, dark stains. A crude altar sat in the center, adorned with more of those spiraled carvings. And there, etched into the stones, were words in a language I didn't recognize. Something primal, foreboding. Then, from behind me, I heard the whisper again, "I see you." It wasn't a voice. It was a feeling, like it was clawing at the edges of my mind. Chris grabbed my arm, his face pale and pointed. A figure stood on the opposite side of the circle, just beyond the trees. Its form was blurred, almost melting into the background, but its hollow eyes fixed on us. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move as it stepped closer. Suddenly, Chris snapped. He bolted, running through the trees as fast as he could. I hesitated, trapped by the figure's gaze, but then I heard Chris scream. His voice cut off sharply, leaving only the whispering trees in that humming, vibrating louder until I thought my skull would split. I ran, stumbling through the underbrush, my heart pounding as branches clawed at my skin. But no matter how far I ran, I could feel it behind me. A constant, steady presence, just beyond my vision. It felt like hours, but I finally burst out onto the main trail, stumbling onto solid ground beneath the open sky. I gasped, my legs weak, lungs burning as I took in the sight of something familiar, a path leading back to safety. The hum had faded to a dull memory, and the feeling of being watched ebbed with each step forward. I didn't dare look back, even as I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the weight of unseen eyes lingering just beyond the tree line. I kept walking, faster and faster, until the forest finally fell silent behind me.